the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Conan, destined to bear the jeweled crown of Aquilonia upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
Join the Betamax Video Club, rewinding back to our favourite films of the 1980s. My name's Rich Nelson, and tonight I've rented Conan the Barbarian. Joining me is Ty Singh.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Now Ty, this film ties in nicely with your new book, Born to be Bad. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so Born to be Bad, Talking to the Greatest Villains in Action Cinema is my first book, and basically it's me tracking down all the actors that play the most memorable villains from my childhood. So all the films that we grew up watching, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, or RoboCop, or Total Recall, or Bond films. Basically, what I tried to set out to do was interview all the actors that stood out in those films, playing henchmen, or the big boss, or hired killers, or intergalactic bounty hunters, and basically just kind of find out about their experiences making these films, and whether it was a boon to their career, or whether it, for many, it got them pigeonholed in these types of roles going forward.
What we'll do is, as we talk about this film, we'll make several mentions, because this film is certainly one of the earlier 80s ones that features one of your guests and makes regular appearances on your Twitter feed, Sven Ole Thorsen.
That's true.
Yeah, so he's in this film. Now, a lot of people may not recognise the name, but if they're into any sort of Schwarzenegger film, we'll talk about this, The Running Man, he was in Predator. This guy, now you've obviously spoken to him and included him as part of the book. What's he like?
So Sven was essentially a Danish powerlifter back in the 70s, and he got to know Schwarzenegger basically through Arnie's bodybuilding status as a superstar, and I think he came out to Denmark, and him and Sven, kind of became friends. And when Sven moved to LA, Arnie was, really the only guy he knew there. And so basically Sven, being Sven, kind of carved out a career by sheer force of will. John Milius hired Sven to be Thorgrim, who's one of James Earl Jones's main two henchmen in the film. And from that, he would just kind of go on to do more and more action films, often where they needed like a really big, imposing figure to stand up to people like Arnie. But then he wasn't just doing Arnie's films. He wasn't just getting these roles on the back of his friendship with Schwarzenegger. So John McTiernan cast him as like the chief of the boat in the Hunt for Red October. He's in Hard Target as one of the people that's hunting Jean-Claude Van Damme. He was in Gladiator as Tigris, the gladiator that comes out of retirement to fight Maximus. He's wearing the mask. So Sven has had like a really long career, and while the name might not ring a bell to many people, the face certainly will, just because he's been in so many things.
And we talked about him in a previous episode we did, The Running Man, because he was essentially the henchman to Damon Killian's game show host, who at the end, when Killian insisted he fight Arnie, because he'd been poking him with all these jokes about steroids throughout the film, it kind of got to a head and he just went, no.
No, yeah.
And you kind of understand why. But, he's very much a foil for Schwarzenegger. But as you say, he's gone on to do such, it's easy to say a wide range of things. But the fact that, he starred in things like Gladiator and Hard Target, it's a wide range within the action genre anyway.
Exactly. And like all actors, he's kind of done little bit parts. But when you're talking to him, he's basically carved out his career just by pushing his way into roles. He told me a great story about how he just got a job on Baywatch by just driving straight down onto the beach in his Jeep and kind of walking up to David Hasselhoff and going, "Hi, David, I'm Sven. Give me a job," and got a job. So I mean, he's not a small guy, and I'm sure it's very imposing, having this real life Viking come strutting down a beach towards you and kind of going, "Give me a job." But it's worked for him, and he's still working to this day. And because he's not like a superstar actor who's kind of got to worry about their public image in the way someone like Stallone or Bruce Willis does, he's very candid. He's happy to talk about the people he worked with, the people who he loves, the people who's kind of pissed him off over the years. And when you're writing a book, he's like the ideal person to talk to because he doesn't varnish anything. He's very forthright about, the career he's had and, the people that essentially have been dicks on sets and he doesn't have time for.
And that's exactly the sort of candy you want, really, isn't it?
It makes for much more entertaining stories.
I mean, this film in particular, when I watched it in preparation for the pod, it was the first time I'd watched it all the way through in a long, long time. And parts of it you can watch and almost see, and I kind of did a live tweeting about it until my internet cut out. Watching it, it was kind of a sort of cross between a very camp 80s film version of Game of Thrones, and yet you had a lot of the usual Schwarzenegger tropes, but it was a really good role from James Earl Jones.
And the way they kind of give James Earl Jones like bluey purple contacts, it kind of makes him look like a race of man that no longer exists and comes from this world that is before the waters drank Atlantis and before the rise of the sons of Arius. That kind of like touch that John Milius puts in, it's all these little things like snake cults and just the look and design of the world, and it was filmed in like Spain. It kind of gives it this authenticity that I think very few fantasy films of that time actually had, because most of the time they were just shot in the UK with kind of UK actors in all these roles. But because of, where it was shot, and I think kind of Milius's fascination with the world, and I think Milius's politics are very famous. He's quite right-wing, and the film even starts off with a quote from Nietzsche. He kind of puts a really raw authenticity into the world that I think in any other filmmaker's hands would have been even camper. But I think the way he makes it kind of sells it.
And it's funny because the first thought I had when we meet a young Conan who's played by a young Spanish guy, his dad is basically teaching him these stories about beasts and the world that they grow up in, and his mother protects him in the way that a mother would, is this striking looking woman who, let's be honest, is a dead ringer for Melania Trump. And she sort of protects him because their village gets raided by James Earl Jones's snake cult. And him and his two goons rock up. And I know Sven is one of these goons. And the first thing I thought, though, was their hair looked exactly like something out of a glam rock band, the sort of Slade or that you see on Top of the Pops too.
That's the thing. I mean, they kind of look ridiculous. And then you have that scene where there's no dialogue and the music slows down. And because James Earl Jones is essentially a snake god, he just kind of hypnotizes her with his eyes to kind of yield to him. And again, with any other actor or kind of any other director, that could be played, very differently. But I think in Milius's hands with James Earl Jones, it's really fascinating to watch.
I think the strange thing is, because this film came out in 1982, so we're talking that James Earl Jones has voiced one of the most famous film characters of all time, even now, in the pre-internet days and even before most home video. A lot of people certainly wouldn't have recognized him. And because he didn't speak for quite a while into the film, he's a very interesting, mystical looking guy with a sort of noddy holder haircut. He manages to convince a woman to drop her sword in front of her child. It's crazy, really, but that says a lot about him, that he can pull that off and that menace without using his one of the most famous voices in cinema.
Well, I think, James Earl Jones was, a fully trained actor. And I think for him, these roles don't come along very often. I mean, they don't these days for actors of color. They're not really offered, these kinds of larger than life figures. So I think, he grabbed it with both hands. And that scene where he's talking about, the power of the flesh over steel, and he makes that young girl jump to her death, and he goes, that is strength, that is power. He's kind of playing it to that almost Shakespearean level, which I think is why you need an actor of his caliber, because I don't think someone, like Arnie, if he was playing the bad guy or, a big muscular guy, could have pulled off that sense of menace.
I say menace is by far the best word you can use for him, because throughout the film it becomes obvious that he is the leader of a snake cult. That we also learn that he has these sort of shape-shifting powers and even becomes a snake at one point, which is bloody weird.
It's so well done as well. In a world of where CGI kind of graphics, you kind of get just used to them. When his face starts pulsating and it kind of starts to elongate, you just kind of like, oh yeah, good old-fashioned physical effects. They look great.
And yet it's still better than the ones in Teen Wolf and Thriller, which came later on.
Well, I think they're very different, but yeah, no, I'll take those any day over kind of the stuff you get these days.
I thought it was hilarious the way he slithered off like a snake, yet managed to keep his robes on. It was all very surreal.
Well, he's just watching an orgy and just kind of goes, you know what, I'm going to turn into a snake, because what I do when watching an orgy.
He's like dogging for a mystical age. But I mean, after this first scene, because Conan's parents are killed, and it transpires that this cult take the kids off, because essentially kids are assets that can be trained, and they use them and put them into slavery, pushing this giant wheel around. I'm not sure what it does, if it's some sort of mill, or I always thought that was under the revolving sign of New Scotland Yard. But he turns from this sort of scrawny 9-10-year-old into early 80s Schwarzenegger at his peak, really.
And the way they're doing it is they're tracking like the development of his thighs as he's kind of pushing the wheel. You don't really see his face, but you see his legs pushing it, and the legs just get bigger and bigger until it's like an early 20s Schwarzenegger, and then his face kind of appears and you just see his back muscles and everything. So it's kind of like they just use this kid pushing a wheel just to kind of show, yep, good upper body development comes from 15 years of slave labor.
So I think a lot of people these days probably watch that and think, ooh, good idea. But it's definitely one for kids. Make sure you don't skip leg day.
Exactly, yeah. It's a new form of CrossFit, just pushing a giant wheel.
Obviously, Schwarzenegger Conan is now Schwarzenegger. He becomes this gladiator because, of course, he's a huge bloke. Let's stick him in a ring, but that's putting it mildly. Stick him in a big hole in the ground with a load of blokes, and he soon becomes this sort of gladiator. He's like a god in there, isn't he? He just kills everything that comes before him and gets all the trappings of victory and fame.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is how quickly it moves. So it's just kind of, we're there to establish that Conan's a badass and he trains daily with a sword, to kind of sell the fact that later on he'll be this kick-ass warrior. And then before you know it, his masters let him free. He's running away from a pack of wolves, find a sword, and, he's on his way on search of new adventures. It all moves pretty quickly, and very little is done in terms of exposition. You've got Mako kind of narrating it, but nothing comes from Arnie, because I think Milius wisely uses him very sparingly. He just gives looks and every now and then just says a line about crushing your enemies and seeing them driven before you. But this is why I think roles like the Terminator and Arnie fitted him so well this early in his career, because he does quite a lot with relatively little.
This was one of the first films he did that wasn't dubbed. So I guess I never saw the dubbed version of Hercules in New York.
Oh, I have. A screening of it here in Bristol, actually.
Oh, of course. Tell us about your Bristol Bad Film Club.
Oh, so the Bristol Bad Film Club is basically we do monthly screenings of cult films, or films that are so bad they're really entertaining.
Anyway, back to Conan. We've already met the crazy witch woman who really scared the bejesus out of me as a kid.
They had sex, and then she turned into some sort of grot bags. I don't even know what that was about.
If you've ever listened to the DVD commentary of this film, it's John Milius and Arnie, and basically Arnie's main comment throughout the commentary is basically him commenting how much sex he has in this film. Because basically it's Arnie's, I think, first love scene, and compared to Sandra Bergman, is it Sandra Bergman who plays his
Yeah.
lover in it? He was massive compared to her, and she was like 6'1". There wasn't any female stunt doubles for her because no one else had like a physique like she did, and it's incredible. But I just love how him and Subotai form like a little thieving duo and just debate about religion, and when they're not doing that, they're just getting drunk in towns and punching camels.
It is a bit of a buddy road trip adventure in parts, isn't it?
It is. I really like the little relationship they have and the sparring. Both of them just kind of getting drunk in pubs, and it's kind of something you don't really see that often. It kind of takes the time to like build up this little rapport between the two of them.
They've met Sandor Bergman's character, the thief, and they form this little trio. Eventually, as part of Conan's ultimate revenge, really, and the people who killed his parents, they steal the jewel from the cult while there's another sort of sacrificial orgy type event going on. Looks like some sort of Scientology meeting. That was really freaky as well, because again, it was just an attractive woman in robes ready to throw herself into a pit with a snake that looked like the size of my car.
I think what it kind of shows you is that this cult has a very strong pull for very naive or damaged women, which is why King Auric kind of hires them to infiltrate the snake cult and to kind of bring back his daughter, who has also fallen under its sway. And I think if you've ever read anything about cults, they always target those who are lonely and those who are kind of vulnerable. And in a world like Conan's, it's just filled with lonely and vulnerable and damaged people when you've got raiding parties and just people getting raped and pillaged on a daily basis. So I think that kind of just works in really nicely. But the whole massive snake thing, it's one of those practical effects that you just don't see enough of these days. And it holds up. It holds up really well. I mean, granted, it doesn't do much, but what it does do is enough.
Well, the thing is, they have to physically interact with it. It's still better than most of the Star Wars prequels or anything like that, where it's just them and a green screen, and you can almost see what looks like a Commodore 64 powering the effects there.
Oh, well, it's not really that. It's also just the eye lines aren't matching. Ewan McGregor is clearly not looking at what's there, and he was given no direction. And General Grievous is waving like 4 lightsabers in his face, and he's not reacting to it. You need that direction to kind of tell your actor what's going on. But when you've got a physical effect, that's not a problem.
That's not the sort of acting you learn in a school, is it? How to interact with a lightsaber wielding robot who isn't actually there.
Exactly, yeah.
As you mentioned, Max von Sydow, again, another of the Dino De Laurentiis stable, having recently done Ming the Merciless. He's King Orisk, and because he's tried to hire the three, and Conan's the one who kind of takes up the mission, he leaves his lover behind and goes off in search of the king's daughter, but also in a way to infiltrate the cult because he's got his ulterior motives. His sort of ways of doing it aren't exactly subtle. They're a bit more reminiscent of something out of Commando, where he ends up beating up the priest and stealing his robes, going off to the cult temple, and in his efforts of trying to infiltrate, he takes the artifact that he stole from the snake's tomb. But of course, the hired goons know exactly where that's from, and that kind of raises the alarm bells.
Yeah, well, I mean, to kind of quote the trailer for the Mission Impossible film, Arnie's not a scalpel, he's a hammer. And then that's the kind of case for Conan. He's not going to do anything overly stealthily. So they rumble him as soon as he kind of rocks up. Because he's cast off his friends and his mission for vengeance has kind of got him caught, it's a problem. But then he's cast into, was it the Tree of Despair, the Tree of Woe?
Yeah, he's brought in front of James Earl Jones, and again another sort of Star Wars link. He says, you killed my father. Of course, that pays back a little bit.
You killed my mother.
You killed my people.
You killed my snake.
It pays off a little bit later when James Earl Jones claims that he is his father.
Yeah, that is a little bit of the whole Batman and Joker thing. It's like, I created you, and I think that plays well. But again, it's just that delivery of authority and menace that James Earl Jones, I can't see any other actor, even someone like Max von Sydow, just selling it like James Earl Jones does.
He manages to convince, without saying anything, the girl to jump off the side of the cliff, just to demonstrate his point that you mentioned earlier about flesh being stronger than steel.
That is my favourite scene in the film, where he just goes, "That is strength. That is power." That's the scene that always stands out in my head when I think about Conan the Barbarian.
This guy can stand up to this bodybuilding mountain just by demonstrating the power he has over someone, basically ordering them to jump to his death or her death. And then he invites Conan to go and think about what he's done on the Tree of Woe, basically crucifying him in a scene that had the potential to be a bit Life of Brian, but unfortunately there was no singing.
No singing, but a great vulture that has its throat ripped out by Arnie.
That's another thing I'd forgotten. You don't think about, if you see any of these films, like even Life of Brian or Passion of the Christ, it's a vulture goes after Arnie. He's like, now I'm going to rip its throat out. Just brilliant.
And then you have kind of the scene of his friends trying to bring him back from his near-death experience, and a kind of magical scene with demons trying to take him to the underworld, and them fighting to kind of keep him in the land of the living. And it's one of those kind of tone changes that I think works, and again kind of sells the greater world of Conan. And I think that's kind of what I enjoy about this film so much. It is a world of magic and of sorcery, and just kind of Valeria's plea that she will pay the price to save his life. It's all done kind of so seriously, where a lot of the films of these times, if you think about Willow, which was made several years later, but even stuff like Dragon Slayer and everything, it's always kind of done with that little bit of a wink to the camera. But it was films like Conan and also like Excalibur, where they take it really seriously. That's kind of the ones that really stand out and you really remember.
The change where they spend the time sort of inking him up ready for these demons, and the fact that they prepare his body to be sort of treated, and that Valeria's ready to sacrifice herself in order to give him his life back. And there's these gods overlooking everything. I mean, it's fascinating how they do it in a way that it's quite easy. And there are parts in this film that are quite light-hearted, and especially the camaraderie between Conan and Subutai. But no, generally, I mean, that scene worked really well. It kind of just to bring him back, and it's almost like a montage scene in a Rocky film where he gets better, the demons come, and all of a sudden he's off practicing with his sword again.
I mean, think about it this way. It's a film where James Earl Jones picks up a snake, straightens it, and turns it into an arrow. And at no point do you ever kind of question that. It's never anything that I've kind of gone, hang on, did he just turn a snake into an arrow? It's just kind of, oh no, he's the leader of the snake cult. He can turn a snake into an arrow. That's just something he can do. The fact that you don't even question it, I think, goes a long way into how Milius did kind of just a good job creating the world in this film.
And the next part of the film was one we touched on earlier, and maybe touching on isn't the best part, the best phrase to use, where it's essentially the orgy in a smelting factory that could quite easily cause an accident. It made me think of something like Goldmember. And this is where James Earl Jones is sitting there with King Orisk's daughter at his leg, basically watching this orgy going off while the thieves are sneaking in to try and kill him.
I think this was where we should also kind of mention Basil Poldoris's score, because it's amazing throughout, and you've kind of got the main Crom theme that starts off the film, but during the orgy he just kind of changes it into like this really nice melody, as if it was kind of just something that you would play while you're taking a stroll around the gardens of the Palace of Versailles. And he has a way of just changing like the score to kind of suit it. So when Subutai and Conan are running through the fields on their adventure, it has a kind of a very, almost Horatio Hornblower type boy's own adventure. And then you've kind of got the main love theme. And all the way through, it doesn't ever feel out of place. I just kind of felt it was important that we give Basil Poldoris's score, a pretty big shout out, because he went on to do stuff like RoboCop and Starship Troopers. But for me, this is kind of like his definitive work.
And even little things like one of I noticed the part with this, and not just because it was the orgy scene, but there was a very almost Russian influence on the music in that scene. The sort of very heavy beats, and it worked so well. It was different from everything else. Yeah,
It's also to note how many like big, massive bodybuilders are in this film, and this is something that I can actually elaborate on thanks to my interview with Sven in Born to Be Bad. So Sven was actually hired for the film because John Milius was looking for a bunch of big guys, and he asked Sven for like what would be a good name for Thorgrim's character, and Sven came up with the name Thorgrim because, as a Dane, he knows his Norse mythology. And then when it came to casting him in the film, John Milius essentially asked Sven to gather up 10 big bodybuilder types. So Sven put the word out, and essentially they called themselves the Animals. And they all went out to Spain, and just according to Sven, it was just months of them drinking, eating, chasing women, and having the best time of their lives, just riding horses, doing sword play. It sounds like the ultimate lad's holiday. He says, they would take long lunches, drink wine, get into food fights. I can only imagine that Milius kind of ruled the set with like an iron fist to keep all these massive men in line, but they all seem to have a great time. And considering the amount of films he's been on, when I asked him, like, what's the movie experience that most stands out in his head, he always came back to Conan, just saying it was the best time of his life. He wasn't an actor, but James Earl Jones would kind of help him with his lines and kind of give him advice and tell him how to like use the camera. So it seems like that all the testosterone that comes off the screen was probably there on set as well, but everyone just got on really well with each other.
I think that portrays part of the fantasy side of it as well, where men are these big sculpted beasts that, and you need that camaraderie, don't you? Where especially if you're going to be out somewhere different, if you're in Spain where this is filmed, or anywhere on location where you need to have that. And I'm sure Schwarzenegger was a big part of it as well. Him stay, not long being away from the bodybuilding scene. It's crazy, really, how to be a fly on the wall.
I'd also like to, know what the whole writing process was like, because Oliver Stone wrote this with John Milius, and politically, I think at the time those two weren't really on the same page. But it's also interesting that from those two people, the character of Valeria is arguably the most capable person in the film. She never needs rescuing. She's the one that rescues Arnie and saves his life. She gets killed, but even in death, she comes back and saves his life again. She's always the most capable person in the film, and she's always right. She's like, we should just take the money and go. I've never had this much as I do right now, and it's only because Conan's need for revenge kind of overrides everything that he ends up getting captured, and they have to go and save him. And I kind of find that interesting that both Stone and Milius created this really strong, powerful female character, and she was actually also meant to be cast as Red Sonja in that film adaptation, but she wanted to play the villain in that film instead.
Yeah, even her death scene, or supposed death, where she immediately identified, because this was when she was shot with a snake arrow. She identified, right, this is what I said I'd do. I'm paying for your life, essentially.
Yeah.
There were a couple of the cliches in there. I'm so cold. But when Conan, buried, when she dies and he puts her on the pyre, like in Return of the Jedi, and it's all very explosive. You do get the feeling this isn't the last that we see of her.
It's also surprisingly touching because Subatai's crying and Mako kind of goes, why do you weep? And he goes, I weep for him because he's Conan. He'll never cry. And it's that kind of little attention to detail, because you could always just do, oh, Conan's stoic, he doesn't feel anything. But then his friend recognizes that this has completely destroyed him, but his people will never cry, so he will cry on behalf of him. And again, it's just these little touches throughout that I think elevates this film probably more than I think its reputation kind of gets. I think most people think of Conan as just a big grunting Arnie swinging a sword, but there's lots of emotion and lots of pathos throughout the film.
And while he's the, in hindsight, and at the time he's the big name, it was the supporting cast who really lifted it, and as you say, giving it that emotion from his accessories, as it were, and then the acting, the real physicality on the other side as well. I think having come back to it this time round, you do get a completely different viewpoint of it.
Yeah, and I think the sequel, essentially without Milius there, it's a lesser film by all accounts. Everyone knows that Conan the Destroyer is nowhere near as good as Conan the Barbarian, and I think not having Milius there, it's very obvious in these kind of moments in the original film.
Well, after this leads to the climactic battle. Anyway, it's with Conan and Subutai and Mako. They set their little sort of Stonehenge-y sort of lair. It's almost reminiscent of Predator or Home Alone, when they put all these traps around, because they know that there's only two and a half. Mako's a wizard. He's not really a warrior. They set these traps with various spikes and ways of catching people out. It's very clever that it shows that they need to have some intelligence. They can't just go out and batter these brutes who turn up to kill them. That part where Schwarzenegger does his prayer to Crom.
Crom, I've never prayed you before. I have no tongue for it. No one, not even you, will remember if we were good men or bad, why we fought or why we died. No. All that matters is that two stood against many. That's what's important. Valor pleases you, Crom. So grant me one request. Grant me revenge. And if you do not listen, then to hell with you.
To hell with you, which is what he said at the start of Running Man, wasn't it?
Well, it's also noteworthy that it's probably the most lines that Conan says in one go. His final kind of battle prayer. It's, Crom, grant me this one request. It's kind of fitting that before he's about to go into battle and have his last stand, the man of very few words and who doesn't really pray, despite believing in Crom, this is when he does his big speech. And it's not even that big because, again, Milius knows to play to Arnie's strengths, which is not that much dialogue.
And anything, if you come back to this at the other end of Arnie's acting career and looking at this is what you want from an 80s Arnie film where he's talking about give me revenge, and it's exactly what you want to see.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, Arnie's been talking for years about doing a King Conan film where he's older and sitting on the throne and, he's not happy with how his life has gone. I'd be really interested in seeing that. But the only problem is the Arnie of today would have much more dialogue than the Arnie of 1982. And I just don't think it's a character that really needs it. Arnie might be aware that, it's a character where he doesn't need to speak too much and, he's a man of action and not words. But unfortunately, because Arnie's not, the major box office draw that he once was, I don't think we'll ever see that film come into development. But, I'd love someone like Amazon Prime just to kind of take a gamble on it and just make this small 40 million, Conan film.
It's funny, since he left political office, he has done a wide range of films, wider than most of the ones he did during his main acting career. And this seems like, if we avoid the Terminator returns over and over again, this seems like at least if he was enough to realise that while he's the draw, he doesn't need to be the one with all the screen time.
Exactly. I mean, I kind of think that this is some very interesting choices that Arnie's making. Like Maggie was a really interesting choice, and I was glad that he was willing to take that risk. And killing Gunther, I haven't seen it, but by all accounts, he's not the lead, and he's just willing to kind of laugh at himself. I know he's made that film, that Russian fancy franchise film, Journey to China, with Jackie Chan, that by all accounts is pretty terrible, but I'm sure he got a good paycheck. It's kind of interesting to see that he might be poking fun at himself in this Kung Fury film, but I'd rather see stuff like that than being wasted in Terminator Genesis, which was terrible. And I really don't want to see triplets, which he's kind of been talking about for ages. And he's always underused in the Expendables films. So instead of kind of playing up to this or trying to be like the action star that he was in the 80s and 90s, I'd rather see him do stuff like Maggie. Or I'd rather see him kind of being the more grizzled action star like he was in The Last Stand. I think that kind of recognized his age, and that wasn't really a big budget thing. But I like the fact that he's willing to take risks.
Just on a subject, that Escape Plan film, because at the time of recording anyway, and it's late July, the sequel to that is out, and it's got Stallone and Dave Bautista in it. Now, I can't remember, did Schwarzenegger die at the end of the original?
No, he didn't. They broke out and, they went their separate ways. But by all accounts, it played better in Asia than it did abroad. So Escape Plan 2 is kind of like Stallone's barely in it, and then it's a mainly Asian cast. But by all accounts, the reviews are disastrous. But to be honest, I was never a massive fan of Escape Plan. I saw it when it first came out, and I literally couldn't remember a thing about it the next day. And last year, I hosted an event to celebrate Arnie's 70th birthday called Arniegeddon, where we did 3 Arnie movies. We did Conan, we did Kindergarten Cop, and we did Commando. We got loads of box sets sent to us, and the studio sent us like 20 copies of Escape Plan. So I thought, I'd watch it again, and I just fell asleep during it. And it just wasn't that great. And I say that as someone who loves Arnie. Yeah, so when they announced a sequel, I quite honestly couldn't have cared less.
And I suppose we can just say that we're glad he's not in it.
Yeah, he probably dodged a bullet with that.
Yeah. Well, the final scene of this film, this was the meeting again, and we touched on it earlier, where Conan meets James Earl Jones, to give him his full name, and this is in the Snake Temple. This is where he's saying that I created you, you're my son, I'm your father. I think again they're sensible not to have a battle between the two, because that would be weird.
They know that, play to your strengths. James Earl Jones is the actor. Arnie's the man of muscle. Beat him with words. You can't beat him hands to hands. It's like Quantum of Solace, where Daniel Craig's fighting Dominic Green at the end. The French actor who plays Dominic Green, he's like 5'8", and is kind of weedy, so he's nothing compared to Daniel Craig. So he just plays him like a psychopath, screaming and scratching and rampaging with an axe, because in a hand-to-hand fight you're never going to win. And I think they made the right decision in Conan. Conan, again, man of little words, just goes straight for the head.
I thought this would be like the end of Team America, where they're saying, right, out-act me, come on. But fortunately, this is James Earl Jones manages to try and get some sort of Uri Geller style lines in, trying to get inside his head. And there is a couple of seconds where you can see that Conan is a little bit disoriented by the fact that he's, maybe you're right to an extent, and then all of a sudden it's like, no, off with his head.
No, and takes the princess back, and the scene is set for more adventures of Conan, which you got for one more film.
Yeah, and I mean that's a film on the list, but as you said, it's very much a sequel, but in design and in the thought behind it, it's a very different film.
I think in terms of 80s kind of fantasy films, there are others that you could take ahead of Conan the Destroyer that would be more interesting. I think even Red Sonja with Bridget Nielsen would be a more interesting look than, Conan the Destroyer, because it tries to do something a little different. Then you kind of got Willow and Krull and Lady Hawk and Dragon Slayer, even Beastmaster, all these kind of films, and Excalibur. They're all kind of around the same time, that 1981 to 85 time when, they were making these kind of films. So if you were looking to get more fantasy out there, I would, leave Conan the Destroyer on the shelf and go for Krull.
I'm not sure how many Stallone fanboys I've got listening to the podcast, but at the time of recording, anyway, this is the fourth Schwarzenegger film that I've done, and I haven't done any Stallone ones yet. So people will moan.
Definitely get on that. I mean, I'm a Stallone fan, so I'm always up for an appreciation of his films, because you see how he kind of goes from playing these very vulnerable, damaged characters in the first Rocky and the first Rambo films. Like, Rocky's kind of very, broken. He just wants his shot, and Rambo's severely damaged. And then by the time it's Stallone the superstar, Rambo and Rocky are very different. By the time it's First Blood Part 2 and Rambo 3, they're almost completely different characters, because you're writing these scripts to Stallone the superstar rather than the character. So, I mean, there's lots of stuff to get into on that.
Well, that's all to come. And now, coming back to your book, most of the films that I've enjoyed the most doing for this podcast, you've actually spoken to the villains behind. I mean, we've got everything from Commando, which I've done, to the Karate Kid, Superman 2, which is one of my favourites. Obviously, your book isn't entirely sort of restricted by the 80s. Do you want to tell some of us who else do you speak to?
Basically, it was all the villains I grew up watching in TV, in cinema. So it's not limited to just the 80s. But obviously, a big impact growing up was Die Hard, and unfortunately, we've lost Alan Rickman and Alexander Godunov, who played Carl. But I was able to track down Andreas Winewski, who played Tony, Carl's brother. Your listeners might also remember as Necros, the big blonde KGB henchman from The Living Daylights. So we spoke together. I also spoke to Clarence Gilliard Jr., who plays Theo in Die Hard. Dennis Hayden, who plays Eddie. He's the henchman on the front desk. He's like the last man standing with Hans Gruber by the end of it. And Ao Leong, who many of you will know, he's like token Asian henchman in every great action film of the 80s. So he's in Die Hard, he's in Lethal Weapon, he's in Big Trouble in Little China, he's in Rapid Fire. So I interviewed all these actors about their experiences making Die Hard, as well as all the other action films they were in. But, we got Vernon Wells. I spoke to Derek O'Connor, who actually died a couple of weeks ago, but he played the South African henchman in Lethal Weapon 2. And Bob Wall, who, was O'Hara in Enter the Dragon. Gus Rethwich, who played Buzzsaw in The Running Man. Bill Duke from Commando and Predator. Like you said, Jack O'Halloran and Sarah Douglas, who played Non and Ursa in Superman 2. So all of these people, had wonderful stories to tell about the films they made, and, how appearing in such big films changed their careers. And all of them came from different beginnings. Like, some of them were actors, other people were powerlifters, several were dancers. Everyone kind of had like different ways of how they fell into these films, and lots of them, their careers changed for the better afterwards, or some just didn't have the big break they thought they might have had appearing in some of these films. So it's fascinating to talk to, and it's an insight into kind of like the Hollywood system about how filmmakers view you, really, and people having to fight to kind of get out of that.
It's funny that I suppose this is one of the benefits of podcasting and social media and appearances and things like that, where a lot of these guys who they may not act through, whether it's by choice or because that they don't really get the same sort of roles, and yet a lot of them have almost got a second, I don't want to put it down and say a career, but a lot of them have enjoyed a sort of renaissance in the last few years, where they're now feeling a lot more open about speaking of their experiences and things. And I know I've listened to some podcasts where Jack O'Halloran talked about, and it almost felt sacrilege at the time, where he wasn't particularly glowing about Christopher Reeve.
Yeah, the two of them didn't get on. I mean, he says, in his eyes, no one's played a better Superman. But he kind of clashed with Christopher Reeve quite a lot on set. It's very much kind of a clash of, people coming from two very different backgrounds. But, we all grew up loving Christopher Reeve. And I guess it's almost refreshing to kind of hear someone who just doesn't sing his praises, and kind of Jack O'Halloran doesn't take any shit from anyone. So It's kind of like I don't think it comes from like a place of malice. I kind of feel it comes from, Christopher Reeve was very young, had no idea what kind of a man Jack O'Halloran was, and kind of just rubbed him up the wrong way, whether by accident or deliberately. But it's fascinating. But yeah, like people like Martin Kove, who played Sensei Kreese in The Karate Kid, he's having a bit of a renaissance period thanks to Cobra Kai. And other actors, they don't really act anymore. So when I spoke to Ronnie Cox, who played Dick Jones in RoboCop and Cohagen in Total Recall, he's now a traveling folk musician. He travels around the world, with his guitar, just doing little gigs in pubs and bars. And, music's his life. And he's kind of like, I kind of always wanted to be a musician, kind of fell into acting, and now I'm doing what I love again, music. It's really fascinating to kind of, just hear about these people, and most of them are completely different to how you ever thought about them.
Yeah, and perhaps my favourite in some ways was Bill Duke, and I know that he's got a book coming out soon, hasn't he? I've seen some of his video clips. Yeah,
he is a fascinating man, Bill Duke. I've got nothing but respect for him because he was very open about, Hollywood is always pigeonholed black actors, and when you're a big black actor like he is, he's 6'4", he's 200 and something pounds, they're always gonna pigeonhole you as a bad guy unless you do something to kind of break out of that. He made a very conscious decision during his career that he wanted to play, police captains. He kind of wanted to be seen as a more inspirational figure to up and coming black actors. And now the Duke Media entertainment business that he runs is dedicated to helping black actors. And he's more of a director these days. He's directed everything. Many of your listeners might not know, but he directed Sister Act 2, Back in the Habit.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, he is a man of many, many skills.
Oh, excellent. And of course, Stephen D'Souza gave a little introduction to your book, and he's one of the minds behind some of the all-time classic of most people's 80s movies lists.
Yeah, so he wrote Die Hard, he wrote Commando, he wrote The Running Man. But how I ended up kind of first making contact with Stephen was actually through the Bristol Bad Film Club. Because a few years ago, we did a charity screening of the film Street Fighter, which he wrote and directed. So I had kind of reached out to him, just kind of with like a few kind of questions, just kind of saying, look, we're doing this charity screening of Street Fighter and the experiences that you had. And instead of just sending back like answers to my questions, he filmed himself like a high production video, just answering all my questions. He was very forthright. He talked about clashing with the studio, having to put in all these new characters because that's what the computer game makers wanted. And it was amazing. He went above and beyond for like a little crap Bristol-based film club that was just screening Street Fighter. So when I was kind of writing this book, and I was like, he's written some of the best villains of all time, I just reached out to him, and he very generously agreed to just write the introduction to my book.
Well, I remember seeing Street Fighter at the cinema and was massively disappointed, although Kylie Minogue was in it, so it had its pros.
Well, I think he just recently did an interview with The Guardian all about the making of Street Fighter, and in that article he was very open about how Jean-Claude Van Damme was coked out of his mind. To quote Mr. D'Souza, I'm sure your listeners can Google that article. I think it only came out last week, but it's a fascinating read.
Another legend of cinema.
Yeah.
Anyway, so tell us, where can we get your book from?
So, I mean, it's available on Amazon, but the publisher is Bear Manor Media. If your listeners are based in the US, that's probably the best place to get it from. If you're based in the UK, Amazon UK, or go to your local bookshop and ask them to order it in. You can find me on Twitter at Timon Singh, or the Bristol Bad Film Club is at the other BBFC.
And as we discussed earlier, it would be nice to have you back on in the future to talk about the Miami Connection.
Well, absolutely. I'd be more than willing to talk about Miami Connection, because as with some of the greatest So Bad They're Amazing films, the story behind Miami Connection is even weirder than the film itself. So I'd be more than willing to come back to discuss that.
Okay. Well, as is usual on the podcast, I will close by playing the song that was number one in the UK at the time the film's release, which in April 1982 was Seven Tears by the Goombay Dance Band. You know them. I don't. Ty, thank you very much for your time and for talking about your book.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And we'll speak to you soon. Cheers.
Cheers.
If one day they reach some distant borders, then you know it's sent with love from me. Here I stand, head in hand, lonely like a stranger on the shore.
This podcast is part of BritPod Scene, an independent network of uniquely British podcasts that's always growing. Check out BritPodScene.com or BritPodScene on Twitter to find out more.